He isolated the first cancer gene through his work in retroviruses in 1970. In 1986, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. He was also the recipient of a 7-year Outstanding Investor Grant from the National Institute of Health from 1985 to 1992. Please give a warm Academy welcome to Dr. Duesberg.
AIDS since 1984, no evidence for a new viral epidemic, not even in Africa. That title actually is the answer to the title in the advertisement from Rich Fisher, AIDS since 1984. What happened? Well, what happened is that there is no new AIDS epidemic. As you will see, it is a lot of propaganda, but there is really no new general AIDS epidemic. It was said to be, when the virus was first discovered, to be a sexually transmitted virus that would spread like syphilis in the general population, provided, of course, they have sex. And there's circumstantial evidence that sex is still practiced in America. We are producing about 4 million babies. I have, of course, never done it since then, for that, to be on the safe side. My friend Gallo told me, watch out, no contacts with anybody. So here's the rise, so I describe it now, so from what I see now, as the rise and fall of the virus AIDS hypothesis. Is it already a chapter of scientific history, you may ask, and I will try to convince you indeed it is. As you will see, I think the answer is yes. The origin of the virus hypothesis in 1984 was a sensational battery of 4 papers in Science. And Gallo pointed out to me, we were good friends until then. Now it's not so good anymore because I question him. But that any scientist had a paper in Science is already a triumph. It's the most popular American scientific journal. But 4 in the same issue, that was an absolute record. And so he said, with these papers, the mystery of the non-understood or misunderstood AIDS epidemic is solved. It's a virus, and everything will be in order. We only make a vaccine and antiviral drugs. And I would be rich and famous and get a Nobel Prize too. I mean, that's Gallo. I'm talking about him now. So Science is the most prestigious journal. NIH is the most powerful institution in medical science in America, if not in the world. And the public press, above all the New York Times, had cultivated the propaganda that AIDS is a sexually transmitted disease. With a spokesperson like Liz Taylor, we are all in this together. And she probably was, but never got AIDS, huh? Luckily, and I am. But if you look even at that first paper that they published, you can see some critical flaws. And 2 of them I want to point out that are most critical here. See, is the pointer built in here? Oh, not separate instrument. Okay. The causal virus, as it is called in these papers, you see the virus is the primary cause of the epidemic. The primary cause. The causal virus was only found in less than 50% of Gallo's AIDS patients. In adult AIDS with Kaposi, 32% had the virus. In juvenile AIDS, whatever that was, it's 37%. And in clinically infectious, opportunistic infections, that means pneumocystis carinii and things like that, it was only in 6%. That is less than what it is postulated to prove a microbe as a cause of disease, which is 100% correlation according to classic Koch's postulates. I show them in a second for those of you who don't recall it, to define a causative issue. And it is actually, half of it is actually the fault of science. We always say, or pride ourselves, we have these great scientific journals, they're peer-reviewed, there will be no major flaws. The peers are so sophisticated, expert, knowledgeable, they wouldn't allow a major flaw to go through. This was a major flaw in one of the most hyped ever papers in the most hyped science journal, Nature, that a peer reviewer wouldn't have said, wait a minute, you can't say this is the primary cause, maybe in 37 or in 40% of your patients, but not in all of them. And the second The second, unbeknownst to science, maybe even to Gallo, I don't know, subsequent investigations of Gallo's lab showed that instead of the 47 isolations which he claimed in that paper, not a single one of them was actually confirmable. They had come from another laboratory. So things didn't look that bright afterwards. And here is what Koch postulates to define a disease, of microbial disease, the cause of disease, are calling for. The microbe, in order to be said is the cause, like tuberculosis in Koch's case, or polio for example, in Ender's case, has to be found in 100% of the cases. If it's not there, how could it be claimed for disease? The second one would be you have to isolate that microbe from the patient or from the disease, not 100 other microbes that are also in that patient. You have to have it isolated or cloned, and then you take the isolated virus and inject it or infect a suitable host. It could be it could be a student or a postdoc or a monkey or a guinea pig or a rat, somewhere. And then if that causes the disease, that's the absolute proof. And Gallo wasn't even meeting in that paper the first step, correlation. The virus wasn't even there in over half of the patients. And science didn't say anything, and Gallo, of course, didn't either. So in the limelight of this hypothesis and the hype that it would soon be, AIDS would soon be under control, the epidemic would be banned before Americans are depleted by the new venereal disease, because as I said, it's incurable, it inevitably kills. And thanks to Gallo, we would now be able to control it. Margaret Heckler, Secretary of Health, even promised a vaccine within 2 years, and then things would all be over. So as a result, the NIH immediately supported all sorts of grants for this. And in the excitement, the virus was named AIDS virus, even though there was really no proof that it was AIDS virus. And that in the literature it was called, or still is called, the immunodeficiency virus, because AIDS is thought to be an immunodeficiency disease. On this one here, so the National Academy of Sciences, the greatest institution in science in America again, and the Institute of Medicine, thus is essentially a similar equivalent institution of doctors. They joined forces to confront the imminent AIDS epidemic that would wipe out all sexually active Americans within a generation or sooner. So alarmed by this new coming imminent epidemic, syphilis type of epidemic, they joined forces and appointed a blue ribbon committee, as they called it, to confront the imminent epidemic. The retrovirus Nobelist David Baltimore, my old friend David Baltimore, who discovered reverse transcriptase in retroviruses and a Nobel Prize for it, was appointed to head this committee and to recommend what could be done to save America before it's too late. Now, here's what the committee recommended. There are 1.5 million Americans, that was in '86 when it was just starting, that are currently infected by HIV. 1 million out of, at that time, less than 300 million. Now we are roughly 300 million. It's not a whole lot, but it's coming. Of these, 20 to 30% are expected to develop AIDS, which was said to be fatal and incurable by 1991. So they knew in '86 it would be infecting 31, and then they said also the increase would go from 1,000 in '86 to 7,000 in '91. That means they were avoiding AIDS pretty well, but not too well. And then pediatric AIDS cases will increase tenfold during that time, from a few to 3,000 cumulative cases at the time. When mother is infected, she would infect the baby would get AIDS and would die. That was natural transmission. The committee thus followed, in fact, exactly the predictions of the classic germ theory of disease, Koch and Pasteur. The microbe infects, and then in a general population, the microbe would spread exponentially. I get infected and cough or huff or have sex with 10 others, and then they have it the next week, and then they, of course, do the same thing with 10 others again. That means an infectious disease, a new infectious disease, always spreads exponentially. And there's no exception. As a result, the epidemic, because of the exponential increase, the epidemic increases within months or weeks after the new virus comes in, and then the course of, in the last 3 billion years of life force, the immune system now sits in and either knocks out the microbe, or if you're unlucky, you'll die from it. But there will be nothing left for the microbe to do within a couple of weeks or months after that new epidemic, because all of them have been infected and now either immune or dead. And the epidemic then declines exponentially again, forming what's called in microbiology, epidemiology particularly, a bell-shaped, classic bell-shaped curve. I show you here the most popular of most of them, the global flu epidemic after World War I, which presumably killed more people than World War I altogether. Like 20 million globally were dying from that flu epidemic. And as you can see, here's that classic bell-shaped curve. It started in October 1918, peaked in November, and had disappeared in... These are original data from the Public Health Service in America. And you see they recorded London, they recorded Paris, Berlin, and New York. They were all there together. As Liz Taylor would have said, we are all in this together on this planet. Here is the epidemic, and mortality in these countries, all of them, from infections at least, died, increased sixfold. So that is a classical pattern that should have happened with AIDS. But the propaganda didn't stop here. It started with the NIH and Gallo, continued with the National Academy and the Institute of Medicine, and escalated further in 2000 with the scientific propaganda in Nature, Nature's Durban Declaration. Not that they hadn't published many papers, but this was about one of the most a high point of the propaganda for HIV/AIDS. And Nature published that in a commentary that over 5,000 scientists, including Nobel Prize winners, throwing, of course, authority into the argument, declaring is typically what scientists are not supposed to do. That's what politicians are doing and priests are doing, but scientists are supposed to prove something or to hypothesize. What they declare is for their weekends or for their non-scientific activities is fine. But they declared that HIV will kill particularly 40 million Africans within the next year or two. They further declared that the evidence for HIV as a cause of AIDS is clear-cut, exhaustive, and unambiguous. And the evidence has not been improved compared to Gallo's paper. There were still a lot of HIV-free AIDS cases. The declaration shows Africa as the epicenter of AIDS. 24.5 million of the world's 30 million by now HIV-positive are Africans, although HIV recognizes no borders. They said that also. But as you see on the following map, I can see some borders quite clearly here. This was Africa, all red, very clear borders, and that's where fortunately, most of the cases where we didn't have to worry too much. It's like Ebola, all these new things are in Africa, or stay in Africa preferably, so you don't have to die here from it, but you can write nice articles about it. So here it was all in Africa, and they were doomed, and in America it was 1 million, and it's 1 million now. Remember, it's supposed to be a new exponentially sexually transmitted disease. Has been 1 million in 85, is 1 million in 2015. That's about as steady as anything can ever get in a population. Nothing new whatsoever. But so these were doomed, and they were now going to die from this epidemic. And they didn't dedicate much space to prove what they said. But on the 2 pages that they used, they had a cute 1 page was taken up almost completely by this nice picture of smiling. It didn't look like AIDS patients to me, but you were supposed to see them dying very soon. That was the implication of that picture. In that picture, they repeated what I already said, that HIV is unambiguously the cause of AIDS. So what are the results of the HIV hypothesis now, 31 years later, and not $6 billion spent. It's about 8 to 10 billion by the US alone, the government. And in the other governments that spend much money too, and private foundations as well. Well, here are some of the results. Despite 31 years of efforts following predictions, the virus hypothesis remain unconfirmed. There is no general AIDS epidemic in the US, Europe, or even Africa. General meaning the majority is still heterosexual. I have nothing against homosexuals, but they have kids, and anywhere, the heterosexual couple, say 20, 30 years old with 2 or 3 kids who are dying from AIDS. Nothing is to be found there. Well, you always find 1 or 2 cases in 300 million that you can hype up, and that's what the what the New York Times and these journals are doing. But on the whole, there's nothing there, and I'll show you the evidence in a minute. There is no evidence that AIDS is contagious. That sounds like heresy, but I'll show you the evidence in a minute for that too. Yeah, oh, sorry, no, I have to go back here. There are no vaccines that Margaret Heckler and Gallo had promised. Despite an HIV-AIDS establishment of the most sophisticated, advanced, and wealthy nation in the world, working on it for 30 years, Gallo and NIH, we have no vaccine. Edward Jenner, you remember, the English country doctor, invented vaccination in 1793, not 1970, 1793, 200 years ago, for 60 pounds, he came home with a vaccine against smallpox because he extracted a variant virus from cows that wouldn't cause the disease, but would cross-react and induce immunity, and thus invented the principle of vaccination for 60 pounds. We have spent on vaccines several $10 billion. Nothing is there. So there is no curative medication. The treatments consist what they call antiviral treatments. It's a euphemism for inevitably toxic chemotherapy, DNA chain terminators like AZT. I'll show the evidence again in a minute. And NIH continues to fund only research on AIDS, linking HIV with AIDS. I used to be their blue-eyed boy, and I had an outstanding investigator account, as Wilshina just pointed out. But ever since I questioned that, I didn't get a penny anymore in the last 15 or 20 years. 15 applications, not one funded. Until 1987, I had been 20 years in the field. No application was ever not funded by the NIH. The last one was even the most generous you could get, 7 years of outstanding investigation. Nothing, no. So there's a certain bias here. So unconfirmed prediction number 2, no general AIDS epidemic. Let's start with the one that was the most blatant propaganda piece in the Durban Declaration, where 24 million guys, Africans, were predicted to die within a year or 2 from AIDS because they were HIV positive. You saw the map where they had the purple area. Well, so the reality is, in sub-Saharan Africa, when AIDS began in the 80s, the black part of the continent were 400 million people, 450 people. Despite 30% being HIV positive and should have died, the reality is now 31 years later, we have 1.2 billion of them now. That is the fastest population explosion in the history of mankind, or recorded mankind. There may have been others before. But they have tripled in the time when they were supposed to die according to Nature's Declaration, signed by 5,000 scientists, including Nobel Prize winners. So they're a little bit off the margin. From dying out, we see an explosion of the population, and they're now spreading further as it goes on. Even the New York Times confirms en passant, as they would say, in an article that was not really labeled AIDS, but you could read it, and you could read it yourself if you want, that the African population increased sharply despite HIV. What they said is on May 25, I wrote to the author and he said, yeah, he likes that I wrote about this, but he cannot write much more about it because the New York Times has heavily invested in HIV-AIDS. So the Time published that Africa just reached 1 billion and is projected to be the fastest growing continent for the coming century, despite all this age. The article remarked in passing, the AIDS epidemic, devastating as has not been the demographic disaster that was once predicted. So HIV can't be the killer virus. It's said to be in the Declaration or in the Gallo Papers or the Institute of Medicine or the Academy in 1986. Instead, HIV can now be correlated, I should say, in fact, be credited with the explosion of the African population. All these people were already bleeding hearts that they were losing the blacks in Africa, now couldn't rejoice because they had so many that they cannot let them leave their country and land in Europe or in America for better lives. And so it is just actually literally the opposite of what they predicted. And what became of the general AIDS epidemic foreseen by the NIH, Gallo, and Academy confronting AIDS committee? Here is the result of that one. The predicted sexually epidemic in America, considering that 300 million Americans produce roughly 4 million babies per year, and there's as yet no vaccine against this sexually transmitted disease or epidemic, the germ theory would predict a huge general epidemic of heterosexual AIDS since America. Exactly what Gallo and the Blue Ribbon Committee predicted too. But this did not happen. Instead, we found a steady, not exponential, and thus not new and not viral, I said it's steady, microepidemic of a total of 0.01%, or about 20,000 AIDS cases per 300 million. I'm not saying that's irrelevant, and we shouldn't pay attention to it, but it's certainly not a general epidemic, and it's not a threatening number, and it hasn't changed a bit in the last 30 years. It hasn't gone up or hasn't gone down. And all these cases are from what they call, at the NIH and at the Centers for Disease Control, risk groups that did not form a bell-shaped curve of a new pathogenic virus anywhere inside. Risk groups is, I have the risk groups in a second, but yeah. So this slide here from the NIH, I mean, at the very first sight, and I think it's probably tried to present it this way, say, what do you want, Duesberg? Here you have an exponential rise and fall. But that is quite deceptive. Even the peak of this curve, we are here at 40 or 50,000, that may be close to 0.02% of the population. Not, if you had a general sexually transmitted disease population, we would have, they predicted like 10, 20, 30% would die. This would be millions, literally 100 million perhaps. But we're talking here still about either 40 or what's leveled off now and completely flat until further, namely until now, that curves. This, you can see, it's very hard to see actually. They literally hide it a bit. See, here's 1995. It's a cute slide, but they in fact admit here that the increase in the AIDS cases in the first 5 years was a mixture of an epidemic of testing. Every good doctor wanted to do an HIV test. $50 to $100 doesn't hurt. And all the blood donors were tested. These are 20, the army was tested, the maternity clinics were tested. It's about a $20 million test business per year now. Times $100, it goes up in the billions. Good business. So everybody does it, even now does it. But it didn't come up with AIDS cases ever more than 40,000. And since the testing also was not very reliable, and it has become more reliable ever since. Here's 2008 or 9 in that curve. They don't show the new ones. 2015 is still all the same. So there was an inherent, quote, micro-epidemic or endemic of HIV positives, of which 20,000 roughly per year developed AIDS. And no, not consistent with the oops, see, here again is how it should be if it had been a new epidemic. Not decades here, this is months, 2 or 3 months up and down. This is how a flu season looks. Even Ebola didn't last longer than 1 or 2 months. In the press, we had 1 case in America. The others are all in Africa, where you can make claims without too many problems. Nobody can check it. So, the sum then, AIDS in the US since '84, there's no exponentially rising new AIDS epidemic. This curve was from the CDC, not me. I did the one with the beautiful colors I showed you, with the 20,000 cases per year. And I'm not saying they're trivial. I'm not saying they shouldn't be paid attention to, but it's not anywhere near what they advertised. But it's a steady micro-epidemic of long-established risk groups, as they call it. So instead of the predicted new AIDS epidemic, there is a steady micro-epidemic. The steady time course and the restriction to risk groups exclude a new viral epidemic. So what are these risk groups then? Here they come, also from the CDC. And it's the same old cases that were initially mentioned as having first developed AIDS. And they have never left those risk groups. Namely, this is 1 million accumulated over 25 or 25 years. So it's a fairly stable number of 1 million. Over half of them are male homosexuals. And it's not your average male homosexual either. You know, 500,000 in 25 years, that's about 25,000 a year. The average, the estimate is that what up to 10% of the, quote, general population are homosexual. Both ways, lesbian or male homosexuals, or at least partially homosexual. And the rest is mostly heterosexual or bisexual, what have you. Anyway, but it's a small minority, so that would, 10% would be 30 million, divide by 2, leave the girls out, and it's 15 million males. Of those, 40,000 get AIDS. So it's not your average male American homosexual from next door. It's a minority of them. They, as I say, are cruising. They have up to 2,000 to 3,000 sexual contacts in a few years. And that cannot be done with God's chemicals like testosterone. That's done with a lot of chemistry. We look at it in a second. Their intravenous drug uses are the other major component. And then they call them at the CDC heterosexuals at risk. If you look at the fine print, these are heterosexual junkies getting AIDS, female and male. All the female AIDS patients are usually in that group. And then there are the hemophiliacs who get HIV from transfusions and have immunodeficiency, often from transferring of foreign proteins as clotting factors. So that's the epidemic that we really have and that we have from the beginning. Now, if somebody is still, let me see, did I say that here? Yeah. So the steady restriction, oh, now it's all gone. Huh. Let's see, that's bad. What could we do now? Well, is it stopped projecting? No, Yeah, it's all together. So it's half. We did half. It was not even in this file. It was in that. Yeah. It was there. Yeah. But it. Let's say. I think. Yeah. Probably this.
No, because that was date modified. 1252.
1252 is today.
September 9th. No.
No.
September 10th.
Oh, maybe the top one would be there. Yeah. Why did you do that? No.
I don't know.
Maybe this thing here.
No, that's nothing.
No.
No.
That's really a shit thing. Yeah.
What I found here.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, good.
Actually, I'm going to do one thing. Sorry. Just for a second.
Maybe you figure out now how to do it.
I figured it out,
That's great. You did figure it out?
yeah, but we have to find the. Actually, sorry.
Yeah. No, so let's do whatever we did. It would be good for the rest. But
find the slides.
yeah, it was about like halfway through. Yeah, exactly. There we are. Oh, it wasn't before, but this is good enough. Yeah.
So it's to play to mirror it like that. And like that.
From now on, I can click again. Good. Okay. Oh yeah. It's getting better.
High five, brother.
Yeah. Too many settings in these computers to get to. Let's wait until the next slide. But then save some applause for that, if that works. Would be great. Yeah. So for those who are still quite holding belief that maybe HIV is infectious or AIDS is infectious after all, look at these rather convincing statistics. Not one doctor on earth has ever contracted AIDS, not HIV. They say HIV is sometimes transmitted by needle sticks and blood transfusions. But there's not one case in the professional literature that a doctor on earth has ever contracted AIDS from 1 million AIDS patients which they have treated up to 2009. And it continues to be that way. You would see it. You would not see the end of it. It would be in the headlines. Oh, doctor fighting in the front lines against AIDS is dying from the disease. Not one such case. New York Times would dedicate 2 issues to it. And yet there is no vaccine there. If we had a vaccine, we could say, okay, the doctors are protected, the risk is at least low. But nothing. No, they have the same risk as everybody else. 1,000 doctors, by contrast, per year get hepatitis, serum hepatitis, from treating junkies and AIDS patients and all other people by accidental needle sticks or coughing or huffing or feeling or whatever they have to do with their patients. Professional accidents. Not one among thousands of HIV researchers all over the world has contracted ever AIDS from working with HIV. I was in the lab at NIH, Gallows, the Erlenmeyers running around producing masses of HIV for the so-called AIDS test. You need viral proteins to find the antibodies in patient because you can't find the virus in the patient. You use the antibody instead. It's massively produced there at Erlenmeyers. They have lunch there. They have seminars there. They have even relationships there at NIH. Nobody ever got AIDS. These guys know exactly what they're doing. Because they're producing millions of viruses, but never get AIDS from that virus. Only others get it. No general epidemic, we already talked about it. Oh, no HIV-positive hemophiliac has contracted AIDS from their husbands, the wives. You know, the men only get hemophilia practically, get transfusions, become positive, and their wives were supposed to get AIDS from their husbands. Not one case in the literature. No general epidemic, we covered in Africa and Europe. No AIDS epidemic occurred in prostitutes anywhere. That was again the front line of contact with the enemy, the HIV. Nothing there. The porno movies are working fine, oral, anal, anything, at least what I can check, and nobody ever gets AIDS. Not so bad. Huh? So that virus knows exactly what it's doing. So, no pediatric AIDS occurred among babies for millions of HIV-positive mothers, particularly in Africa. As we know now, it's exploding there, despite the high percentage of HIV, which is supposedly in the African population. Now here comes part two. Do I have another hypothesis to replace this? In an effort to explain why HIV has not induced a new sexual epidemic in our country or anywhere, why HIV is not cured by or prevented by the antibodies that are found in AIDS patients that diagnosed HIV positive, meaning antibody. They would much rather find virus, but since there's no virus, when there's antibody, there is no virus. The immune system and viruses are completely incompatible with each other. The virus comes, immune system comes in, and the virus is completely gone. It cannot enter a cell when it's attached to an antibody. Works much better than against bacteria. And why is AIDS not contagious? And why is AIDS distributed only in these risk groups? We have advanced this theory, which is actually kind of obvious and almost old-fashioned. AIDS is a chemical epidemic, not a viral epidemic, caused by the long-term consumption of recreational, psychoactive and aphrodisiac drugs, or inevitably toxic DNA chain terminators and protease inhibitors, which are now prescribed to HIV positive to prevent or cure AIDS. Accordingly, AIDS is largely preventable chemical or medical lifestyle disease. That's, who said, no, I think it was one of my two previous speakers said 30% of us die from doctors. I think that's certainly true for the for the AIDS patients when they get these DNA chain terminators. It's they're designed to kill human cells. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to predict that they would have to die from it. It's a matter of dose and time, but it is not survivable to take DNA chain terminators on the long run, unless you come up with a new form of life, no longer DNA but Teflon or so. But that hasn't happened yet. So what is the evidence for this now? I'll give you some data just briefly. This is from the Centers for Disease Control. They interviewed and checked risk group of male homosexuals. And I point out again, not your average American homosexual male. These are the ones, risk groups, who flaunt often or write about having hundreds of thousands of sexual contacts on a weekend, 20 to 30. And this is how they do it, not with testosterone alone. That may be in there, but of 140 or 50, which they asked, where's the number here? Somewhere. I had it here. Well, here's 120, and there's no 50 here. So it's 170 they asked. 90, that's self-proclaimed. 96% use nitrite inhalants, which give you a high, and which were initially invented to treat angina. When your vessels constrict and you get you cannot breathe. It was an English discovery from Edinburgh somewhere 200 years ago that it opens up relaxes your smooth muscles and also your vessels, and you get a high, and you also, it's a bit like Viagra, you could get an erection and both of it from it. So it's very popular in the AIDS community, in the HIV, in the male homosexual community. 96% said yes, we use that drug. Acid chloride is sort of one like chloroform, and so it gives you a high. Cocaine, that's what I'm trying to prescribe to Dr. Cobb's program soon, we speak to earlier. Amphetamines is a bit a cheap form of cocaine. Phenylcyclidine, it's also a high thing. LSD is the drug of the hippie generation, gives you delusions and everything. Metaqualone, similarly. Barbiturates are sleeping pills, basically. Pot is everywhere. Heroin is not so everywhere, it's too expensive. But this is, the price has to come down someday soon. But as you can see, and these are additive. So there was not one of those 170 men who said, no, I haven't used any drugs. I do it with testosterone and God's drugs, whatever. So they use a combination of these drugs, and they use them for 10 years, and then they get pneumocystis pneumonia or diarrhea or Kaposi sarcoma, and they say, can you find the virus, please, for me and give me a vaccine? That's how it goes. So the widespread use of aphrodisiacs and recreational drugs by a minority of male homosexuals explain why among the sexes, male homosexuals have formed an AIDS risk group. Not because of sex. Sex, even homosex or heterosex or homobestiality or heterobestiality, are as old as life is. Sex was never totally straight. I mean, yes, I am, of course, but for all others, it wasn't totally straight. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Who would bother? It's not an it's not an easy thing. So an additional reason, of course, is, which I come to right in a minute once more, is the treatment of the homosexual or those with HIV with antiviral drugs, which are not even fun. If you have heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, at least you have a good time. But if you get AZT, you are throwing up and bleeding and losing your hair and using your teeth. Not so good as the recreational drugs. So antiviral drugs prescribed to HIV positives, are they AIDS by prescription? If we don't have a virus to kill, they couldn't possibly be justified in any way whatsoever for what they really are. I mean, if you have cancer, it's another matter. That's what they were designed for. Here is the one that was first licensed. ACT means acetothymidine. So this is essentially DNA. Here, you know, DNA are these 4 nucleotides. They all have 2 arms, and they hold on to, there's a 5' arm and a 3' end, and they hold on to each other, these are the hands, and form these large polymers, the chromosomes that are our genome. And what John Hurwitz discovered or invented in 1964 to kill cancer is, let's fool the normal DNA polymerase and throw in the patient an analog of thymidine, or another nucleotide could be used, acetothymidine, where here's normally a hydroxyl group on which the next nucleotide polymerizes, and here's an aceto group, which is a false group the enzyme cannot see. So it's on the right, on the left end, it's called normal, and here's an aceto group, which the enzyme cannot see. So it's a chain terminator. It's built in by the enzyme, expecting it's going to go on from here, but it can't work with it from there on. So you stop the DNA, you kill the cell. Well, a few cells will survive it, but the majority of the cells will die. And that is not a side effect, as they always say. Oh, too bad, a few cells die. Your immune system drops, your hair falls out, but you recover. Not so good. This is not a side effect. It's by design. This is what it was designed for, and it's exactly what it's doing. And if there's no virus replicating tons of DNA, more than you do, then you have a reasonable chance. That's the justification of cancer chemotherapy. The cancer is making more DNA than anything else typically in the cell. So you have a differential killing. It's not pretty, but you get the worst guy first and the patient second. Yeah, that's the strategy. But here, there is no even enemy there. You just treat the patient with ACT. And I cannot see how this could be, and it has never cured anybody, they admit that. We did some tests in the laboratory and bought AZT from a biochemical company. I'm not an MD, so I cannot get it from the doctors, but you can get it from Sigma, it's an old biochemical company in St. Louis. We ordered to test it in cell culture, 100 milligrams. That's a fifth of the dose that is the standard of care for a pregnant mother who is HIV positive in the 3rd and 2nd trimester, developing a baby in the presence of ACT. And that doesn't look all that sweet either. Looks like the ESS to me. I mean, it's not exactly possible. So I don't know why mothers are not supposed to drink beer in America. But when they are antibody positive, they're supposedly taking 5 times that much every day. And here's what they say. You can read it perhaps a little bit. Toxic by inhalation, that's Sigma. Sigma company, biochemical, they're not selling it for patients. In contact with the skin, and it's swallowed. Target organs, blood, bone marrow, that's where the T cells come from. If you feel unwell, seek medical advice. Show the label where possible. They have changed the label now. They had took the skull and crossbones off. And wear suitable protective clothing. That's written for scientists, trained scientists working in laboratory. But the moms who are HIV positive and producing a baby get 5 times as much, and there's a unicorn on it, and both welcome. And yeah, serious. That's how it looks on their label. The same stuff. Now, the problems generated by anti-HIV drugs, there are threefold here. There are 3 fundamental problems. AZT is inevitably immunotoxic. The immune system is one of the most sensitive to chemotherapy. That's why cancer patients get all these infections. And because the immune system has a very high turnover, always recruiting new soldiers for new enemies, possibly infecting you. And the second is the guts also. They are replaced. You have new guts every week because, as is generally known, the guts are full of, you know what I mean? And there are a lot of carcinogens in feces and in guts too. So you get a new layer, and you have a fresh colon all the time so that it wouldn't develop cancer. And HIV is not even replicating in DNA patients of people with antibody against HIV. And HIV is not contagious. Or AIDS is not contagious, I should say. That's the right word here. So first, how is that? How do we know how toxic it is? In fact, there are 2 major clinical trials that were done with AZT, published in the New England Journal is one of them. The first one, it showed life-threatening anemia in 24% of the patients within a couple of weeks. Neutropenia in 60% of the 149 patients. In addition, serious adverse reactions, particularly bone marrow suppressions, were observed, exactly as the label from Sigma shows. Nausea, myalgia, insomnia, and severe headaches were reported more frequently by recipients of AZT. There's more from the same report. Macrocytosis developed within weeks. 30 of 149 patients could only be kept alive by blood transfusions because they couldn't make enough red cells to pick up oxygen to live any longer. By 21 months, 42% of the AZT group was dead, and 35% of the control group had also died from AIDS. Many of the control groups, however, had died not only from AIDS, but also because they now received AZT on a compassionate basis, because it was so nice, so good. Yeah, well, compassionate doctors, it's all what we like. So the second control trial was could it be used for prevention? And that was called the Concord trial, was mainly England and British and French Concord trial. They enlisted 1,749 HIV-free male homosexuals and gave them AZT. And the result was the mortality of the ones with AZT was 25% higher than the ones without AZT. One more facet of the anti-HIV drugs, namely the diseases that these drugs are causing in addition to what's normally called AIDS. About half of the American AIDS patients, when you look at the death certificate, dying now of diseases that are not in the huge definition of classical AIDS-defining diseases. They are drug-induced diseases. Once antiviral drugs were approved, they were treated with antiviral drug cocktails, and to develop, cocktails began to develop and die from non-AIDS defining diseases. The paper here from Reisler from the Journal of AIDS here, the most common grade 4 events, or serious or life-threatening events, are not AIDS defining. They were liver related and cardiovascular diseases, and here it goes on, and continued, and the first grade 4 event and the first AIDS event were associated with similar risk of death. So they got at the same, 50% of them got AIDS-defining diseases from which they died, and the other 50% got diseases that were not known as AIDS. And these were cardiovascular, heart disease, heart attacks or heart breaks, kidney and liver failure, where these talks go through. So El-Sadar's paper in the New England Journal of Medicine is the first author. An important secondary endpoint was major cardiovascular, renal and hepatic disease. These are the chemical plants in the body. The heart pumping the blood through the kidneys and the livers, they get diseases from ACT. Reisler and Sadar conclude about 50% of drug-treated AIDS patients die from non-AIDS defining diseases induced by these drugs. So conclusion, antiviral drugs cause AIDS-defining and non-AIDS-defining diseases. Nevirapine is given mothers, presumably specifically good inhibitor for mothers having HIV-positive or risk of HIV-positive babies, and the risk of several non-AIDS-defining conditions include cardiovascular disease, liver-related events, both of the mothers and the kids, renal disease, certain non-AIDS malignancies is greater than the risk of AIDS persons with CD4 counts. In other words, they get AIDS more often than an HIV-positive so-called patient that has more than 200 T cells, which is considered an AIDS-defining level of T cells. And that's just almost at the very end now. They're very proud there in San Francisco. They have a new campus and an AIDS institute, and say, oh, we nice, we can now, because of these drugs, extend the life of these patients, study aging in them. We have observed that they age faster. Even though we save their lives, they age faster. Not a big surprise when you take ACT. And they show these figures in the New York Magazine. And these are actually quite cosmetically massaged figures that they would release. They don't show you the very real figures. There's one of them that was in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it's a very clean control. This guy was gay from San Leandro, close to San Francisco. He was diagnosed HIV positive and given these wonderful drugs, which he holds here, and survived it for 8 years. But soon after this picture, he passed away, and you can see why. He was a very clean control. He didn't even have HIV. You cannot say it's a combination of AIDS and drugs. It's only drugs. He was HIV positive, but otherwise totally normal guy, or healthy guy, whatever it is, and believed in the virus. Because the doctor says, you better take these drugs or else get AIDS, and here he is. So the doctor's diagnosis, this is what he said, according to Chronicle, the patient exhibited symptoms that could be consistent with an HIV diagnosis, but that diagnosis was in this case proven to be flawed. So conclusions, all scientific evidence available indicates that HIV is a harmless retrovirus like all other retroviruses that have never caused an epidemic of any diseases in animals, monkeys, humans, chicken or mice, wherever we have studied them. In view of the inevitable toxicity of anti-HIV drugs, the epidemiological and virological evidence that HIV does not kill T cells, there is no justification for anti-HIV drugs, from my point of view, of course. Yet lifetime prescriptions of ACT and other anti-HIV drugs are the standard of care of antibody positive in America and also in the rest of the world. Here's actually one glimmer of hope. That's a paper that came out last September from Texas A&M by Professor Pat Goodson. I've never met her, in fact. And she has dared to review questions about HIV hypothesis independently, Public Health Institute, and published it. And the paper was almost censored in Frontiers in Public Health, a Swiss journal. And when you click it and look it up, you'll find that this article for a scientific paper that is rather specialized has been accessed, when I last time looked at it, over 20,000 times. Typically, you're proud if you have, oh, your paper has been accessed 50 times or 100 times. My God, that's good. But 20,000 times. So there must be a reservoir of people who are skeptical about HIV that are not here in the audience yet. And that's at least a somewhat promising sign. Is there any hope? I think you are, for being here. And thank you all for inviting me to this rare free thinking and free speaking conference. Thank you. Yes.